Hi, Megan, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore and the host for tonight's event. This evening, we're pleased to welcome Anne Epstein to our At Home with Literati series in support of the Great Stork Derby. She'll be in conversation with Danielle Lavaque-Manty. For attendees, the chat is closed, but I'll be dropping links to purchase the Great Stork Derby and Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature in your toolbar to submit questions at any time. I'll ask a selection of them at the conclusion of the event. A reminder that you can shop for more books in store at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup and shipping to your home anywhere in the United States. Now allow me to introduce tonight's author and moderator. Anne S. Epstein writes novels, short stories, memoir, and essays. Her awards include a Pushcart Prize nomination for creative nonfiction, Walter Sullivan Prize in Fiction, and Editor's Choice Selection by Historical Novel Review. Her other novels are On the Shore, Tizia and Gemma, and A Brain, a Heart, the Nerve. Her work also appears in North American Review, the Minnesota Review, and elsewhere. In addition to writing, she has a PhD in developmental psychology and MFA in textiles, which shaped the content and imagery of her work. Her website is ascwovenwords.com. Danielle Lavaque-Manty has interviewed many authors for Fiction Writers Review, and her own fiction has been published in Ninth Letter, Untitled Review, and elsewhere. She was also the winner of the 2018 Iron Horse Literary Review Trifecta Prize in Fiction. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Anne and Danielle.
Danielle, you want to start?
Okay, thank you, Megan. Sorry, I was just seeing that typewriter on the screen. So Anne, I'm excited to get to talk to you about your book, and it hasn't been out very long, like a month, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe we could have you give like a super quick overview, and then you were going to read the first couple of chapters, I think, right? Mm-hmm. So people will probably get a pretty good sense of what it's about from your first couple of chapters, but maybe a quick description.
Okay, so the Great Stork Derby, it's based on a bizarre but true event in Toronto history that took place in 1926. And the novel is actually set 50 years later, and it looks like it looks at the impact of this real event on a fictional family. And it's essentially asking the question of whether what I would call a bad dad can make amends with his alienated offspring and learn the true value of what it means to be a father. So I will read the first couple of chapters, and then Danielle will ask me some questions, and then we'll open it up for everybody here to ask questions. Chapter 1. M. Benbow lay on the floor of his house for 2 days after falling for the third time in as many months. He was frightened, thirsty, and humiliated to be soaking in a pool of his own filth. Yelling, "Help!" was pointless because he was upstairs in the bedroom and no one outside could hear. The phone rang once during that time, conceivably one of his children, although their calls were infrequent, and M couldn't remember the last time he'd seen any of them. Another remote possibility was an old friend from his work days, eager to chronicle the betrayals of his own body. Most likely it was the pharmacy calling to say that his blood pressure prescription was ready. Whoever it was, M couldn't move to get to the receiver. Fortunately, a neighbor spotted 2 copies of the Toronto Star in the driveway, and knowing how punctual M was about retrieving the paper by 7 each morning, rang the bell, banged on the door, and finally, after getting no answer, called for help. M passed out in the ambulance. Now, his right flank bruised, he lay on his other side in a hospital bed. "Mr. Benbow," said Dr. Sawyer, a brusque man, half M's age, with no bedside manner. M missed Dr. Marsh, his late wife Isora's childhood doctor, who'd also delivered and tended to their children. Back then, before national health, men like Dr. Marsh made house calls, right to your own bed. This new fellow waved a piece of paper and said in an accusatory tone, "The blood test shows you took an extra dose of medication, which made your pressure drop too low. That's why you got dizzy and fell. You're lucky you didn't break anything this time, but a 75-year-old man in your condition simply cannot live alone anymore." M bristled. He couldn't imagine living anywhere else. The old house was where he'd grown up and returned to raise his own family. Granted, he'd gotten lax about its upkeep, but the foundation was solid. If only the same could be said of him. He'd done pretty well the last few years, especially since he'd switched from drinking whiskey to brewing tea. But if his hands were steadier than ever, his feet were not. The doctor listened to M's lungs and scowled. "Why not move in with one of your children? Lord knows you've got enough of them." "They're busy with their own lives," M said, "and haven't the time or room to take in their old man." Even if they did, he had no desire to concern himself with their problems, or for that matter, to muster the energy to celebrate their successes. They had continually disappointed him with their shortcomings or expected inordinate praise for their minor achievements. Down or up, the house was in perpetual turmoil, a state that persisted until the last one finally moved out. After the hullabaloo of those years, all M wanted was to live out the rest of his days in peace and quiet. True, any offspring who were now living in cramped quarters might welcome the chance to move into the big old place with him. But none had suggested it, and M wasn't about to issue an invitation. Living alone suited him. "You never know how your kids react to the idea of your living with them," Dr. Sawyer said. "They might appreciate supplementing their income with your monthly government pension. In fact, I'm thinking of taking in my wife's mother along with her check, if it means I can retire early." He attempted a chuckle, further proof that the man inside the white coat was tactless. "They can manage on their own," said M. He'd paid the bills while they were growing up, except at the height of the Depression, when 6 months shy of his 30th birthday, he lost his job. But he found work again once the war began and supported the whole brood thereafter. If not in the grand style he'd once dreamed of, then good enough for them to find their way after high school. Having done his part then, he saw no reason to share his hard-earned benefits with them now. Nonetheless, Dr. Sawyer was right. Even if M could stay on his feet financially, it wasn't clear how he was going to do the same physically. The next fall could spell the end, and if he'd begun to decompose before he was found, it would be an inglorious one. "Well, there's always the old age home, Mr. Benbow." The doctor scribbled a note at the bottom of M's chart. "A social worker will stop by to go over your options. I can't discharge you until you have a plan other than returning to your house." He walked to the opposite side of the bed behind M and headed for the door. M tried rolling over to look at him, but the pain along his right side made him wince. So he called as loudly as his bruised ribs permitted, "I'm not going to sell the place. What you do with your house is your business. My concern is your health, and you have two choices, your children or an old age home. See me at my office in 2 weeks, or as soon as you're able to get around with a walker." The doctor's rubber sole squished down the corridor. Through the window, M watched the wind batter a lone leaf from last fall, still clinging to a maple tree on the hospital's front lawn. He considered whether he wanted to spend the time he had left alone or living with a member of his family. The doctor was right about M having plenty of children to choose from. When he and Azora had gotten married, they'd wanted to have several. At some point, however, things had gotten out of hand. M closed his eyes and thought back. Chapter 2. Nearly 50 years ago, on a day as bleak as this one, M had raced into the kitchen of their tiny apartment. Azora, 8 months pregnant with their first child, was resting her swollen belly against the pitted, grimy counter. He slowly waved the Toronto Daily Star in front of her pinched face so she could see the headline. Rich eccentric swill promises fortune to woman having most babies in 10 years. Azora turned off the water and listened as he read her the article. The estate of Charles Vance Miller will pay a grand prize to the woman who gives birth in Toronto to the greatest number of children as registered under the Vital Statistics Act in the decade following his death on October 31st, 1926. Mr. Miller, who has no heirs, described his will as necessarily uncommon and capricious, and proof of my folly in gathering and retaining more than I required in my lifetime. The prize, now worth $100,000, is to be invested with the actual award based on its value at the time the winner is declared. In the event of a tie, the prize will be equally divided. Ladies and the gentlemen who service them, on your marks, get set. The Great Stork Derby has begun. The rest of the article described how Miller, an oddball real estate investor and barrister, delighted in exposing greed. A favorite prank was to leave dollar bills on the sidewalk and watch passersby furtively pocket them. His will also awarded shares in the Ontario Jockey Club to pillars of the community who railed against gambling, and deeded joint ownership of a house in Jamaica to 3 fellow lawyers who detested each other, provided they lived in it together. Goodness, Azora laughed. I can't tell if Mr. Miller was meaner, crazier, or simply had a weirder sense of humor than average. Whichever, he was certainly richer. M wrapped his arms around his wife, just barely. Honey, what if we went after the prize and got rich too? With our first due next month, we've got a head start. The baby kicked, and Azora moved M's hands so he could feel that restlessness too. They smiled at the moving bump in her belly. I don't know, Em. We both want a family, but shouldn't we take it slower? If we lose, we'll be stuck with more mouths to feed than we can afford, or than we want. Azora had only 1 brother, whereas M had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. Azora pictured them having something in between. My parents weren't rich, but we managed. Besides, it was fun growing up in a madhouse with 6 kids, always someone to play with or fight with or drive my folks crazy with. M pressed his hands against his wife's stomach, but the baby had settled down. He watched Azora stare past the doorway to 2 bedrooms and a sitting room, then back to the Eaton kitchen. Just think about everything we'll be able to give our children when we win the prize money. She frowned. If we win. Even supposing we do, where would we raise them all in the meantime? By the time our second child is born, I'll buy us a place of our own. Izora often accused Em of talking big, but it was also one of the things that attracted her to him. He played on that magnetism now. I was going to wait until we were snuggled in bed to tell you, but I'll spill the beans early to convince you I can take care of things. Em spread a fistful of dollars on the table. Mr. Withers did the books this afternoon and promoted me to foreman. Toaster sales are up 20% and exports could triple next year. Oh, Em, that's wonderful. Izora clapped. The baby wriggled again. Now we can start to save money every month. Em thrust out his stomach and waddled, anticipating the smile his wife usually bestowed when he imitated her condition. Instead, Izora eased into a chair and kneaded her lower back. It sounds exciting, but I'm worried. We could end up jinxing this baby before it's even born by planning the next one. And the next, and the next. Em tried to pull his wife into a standing position so he could dance her around the table. When she resisted, he shimmied across the kitchen by himself. Where's the spunky girl I married? He and Izora grinned at each other. They both knew she'd never been spunky. Determined, yes, but cautious in contrast to his devil-may-care spirit. Ask me again in a month, and after we're sure our first baby is born healthy. Em gave her a thumbs up and turned to the paper's racing page. Mr. Miller had a good head for business. Maybe I should invest our savings in the Ontario Jockey Club. So.
Great. Thank you, Anne. So I think it won't be a spoiler. It won't be a spoiler if I tell people that they're not going to win the Derby, I think. But this sets this incident of having fallen that we just heard about sets M off on a kind of a journey. So he will, at the urging of a social worker who will meet soon, he will check out a home for the elderly where he, he's not enchanted by it, shall we say. And so then he begins trying out living with various children one by one. And so it's kind of a road novel, a slow moving one in a way. It's a journeying novel.
It stays in Toronto, but it travels a lot from house to house and adult child to adult child.
Yeah. But I wanted to point out to your listeners here that Derby, that competition was a real historical, actual thing. The Charles Miller, who you were talking about, was a real person. And I'm wondering, Anne, do you remember how you first learned about that Derby?
I think, no, actually, I can't. I know that I either read about it or heard about it, maybe on some kind of radio broadcast. It may even have gotten a small mention in something else, but it led me to write a short story just about the Derby itself. And that story was from the wife's perspective. And she's a pretty sympathetic character, poor put upon woman having all those babies. And then I started to think about what, if you had been a family, a real one that entered, what would it have been like to grow up in a big family like that? And I thought, gee, how could you tell the story from the husband's perspective? Because he's not a particularly sympathetic or likable character. I mean, he pushes his wife to enter this Derby and have one kid after another. So that's how I decided, well, suppose, that the wife has died years before. no surprise after having that many kids. You know, and here's this father who's alienated from his kids, understandably, and what would it be like to tell the story from his perspective? So the short story turned into a novel.
Great. Yeah. And a fun novel. I bet I'm interested in the time periods, you know, so the original 1926, the Stork Derby period, 1926 to 36, right? Because there's a whole decade. But then most of it is actually set in 1976, where we first met Em in that first chapter. And I'm wondering, how much research did you have to do to create that period? I mean, you lived through it, right? But how much research and what kind of research did you do to reconstruct it? Because you have a lot of lovely detail about styles, about food, about how people, what they were watching on television. So what were you looking at to create that?
Yeah, you're right that I did a lot of research. For me, actually, doing the research into other eras in history is part of the attraction of writing fiction. And a lot of it is historical, not all of it, but a lot. And this, because it spanned 50 years, and I was sort of looking at what it was like for each child to grow up. So in addition to the period of the Stork Derby, and then 1976, I was also looking at all the decades in between, which meant I could look at the Depression, World War II, the post-war sort of economic recovery. And then towards the end of that period, it was also an era of the emergence of the women's movement, the gay rights movement, attitudes towards the handicapped were changing. And each of the children, there are things in their individual upbringing or their current personalities that was a chance for me to bring out, you know, those sorts of things. And one of the other things that was fun is Anne was a really big fan of Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, which, you know, which had come out at that time, especially since he was a salesman. So it was fun to uncover all these gems of advice that Anne then tried to apply to his own life and his children. But yeah, I mean, I like to write books that often span a long period of time. That much more research to do. The hardest thing is to pare down. I mean, because I do a lot of research, it's to pare it down to just those few points that really make sense in the context of the novel. Maybe only 5 to 10% of the research that I do actually makes it into the book. So I have to let go. Or as we say, you know, I have to kill my darlings, but
yeah. One of the settings that you portray, I would say kind of chillingly, is the home for the elderly, Kingsbridge. And did you base that on a real place, a specific real place, or?
Yeah, actually a place where I was a junior Red Cross volunteer in high school. And it was actually named Kingsbridge Home for the Aged, or Kingsbridge Home for the Aged and Infirm. Yeah, I mean, back then they really were just called old age homes. Yeah, and I worked there for several years, as they say, as you know, a high school volunteer, and it was mostly for the poor, for poor people, a lot of whom didn't have family anymore, and it was a really depressing, you know, place. And yes, so some of the images were drawn from there, and others, I mean, also I was just doing research. Since this is set in Canada, I was also wondering what was different, about the nursing home situation in Canada. But yeah, I was certainly drawing on, some memories that go back 60 years. So, yeah.
Yeah. Cool. I'm from the nursing home, which I think we can say he desperately wants to avoid having to live there. And so even though he's estranged from all of his children, he takes the plunge and starts living with them. And one thing I really enjoyed about the book is the way that we meet not only each individual child of his, adult child, I should say, right? They're all between like 40 and 50 years old at this point. And so, but we get to meet each child, we get to see each person's household, their different living arrangements. And we also learn a lot about their relationships with one another. So both the children's relationships with their dead mother, Izora, but also their relationships with their siblings. And, some of them have been caretakers for the others, and in fact, kind of still are. So Bruna, the oldest daughter, and then the third child, Daryl, right? They are taking care, well, the third living child, I should say, again, no spoilers, sorry. They are really trying to help everybody else keep their feet as much as possible, but they're not taking care of every single one of their siblings, right? And so we see some people are kind of left out of the various connections. And so I really liked the richness and variety and seeing those different family dynamics in play. And then I really liked imagining these different homes. You portray them as really very different. Some of the children are married, some of them aren't. None of them have their children living with them anymore. But in each case, the sort of lifestyle is different. What they're feeding is different. The way the house is arranged is different. And I'm wondering, Anne, this might not be a fair question to ask you, because I know we're supposed to love all of our characters equally when we write about them. But if you had to live with one of them's kids, would you be able to choose?
Oh my. I think I might almost be torn between, quote, the most well-adjusted and the least adjusted, well-adjusted. I think, living with someone who's very well-adjusted just sort of would give me the freedom and autonomy to do what I want without having to worry about them. On the other hand, as a parent, you want to take care of your kids, you want to be needed, you want to help. And so, I think, probably the child who would need me the most would also be the one that I would live with, because I would still really feel like a parent now.
Yeah.
I don't think, one of his options is to sort of rotate among the children, to not put all the burden on them. But, and some people might like that. I'm too much of a nester. I think I need my place. So I don't think that I could go for that option.
No rotating.
Yeah. But one thing, it was certainly fun also looking at the relationships among the siblings, because in any sort of crazy or dysfunctional family, that dysfunction manifests itself in every way possible. So, some of the siblings are close and supportive. There's definitely some hostility and animosity and rivalry among them. It's I guess kind of a multifaceted web, like all families, and the more characters, the more complex.
Yeah.
That interweaving. Yeah.
They also have very different approaches to food, these different families. And so beginning, if I could say, wasn't, minor spoiler, the first daughter, the oldest daughter who doesn't have her own kids is this wonderful cook. And I was very intrigued by the bacon casserole. I have to go look that up, like what would go in a bacon casserole. I would never eat that, I don't think, but sounded very interesting. And then there are others who really don't cook so much. And then there is even one son who hosts a party where he serves fondue, which totally took me, this was blast from the past for me, because my parents did this once in the 70s. They had fondue pots and, the whole apparatus. I think they only had one party, but they had all this stuff. And so cheese, bread dipped in cheese, and then fruits dipped in chocolate, and
meat dipped in oil. For a real fondue party, you need to have 3 pots. One for the bread and cheese, one for the meat dipped in oil, and then the chocolate one for dessert. Yeah. I had fun. So
fun and kind of, I'm guessing messy, but tasty and interesting. But so what I'm wondering is, how do you think about the role of food? Because I also, remembering other work of yours that I've read, there's always a lot of really rich detail about food and about cooking. How do you think about including it? Beyond period detail, what is it? How do you think about it?
I think, well, first of all, food is such an important part of our childhoods and our family and growing up. And the way that we either do what we were brought up with or do something very different. But to me, food says a lot about certainly culture, as you're saying, era, but also very much family background. It's how we nurture ourselves and nurture other people. The expression of food is love. And it's something that's either given or withheld. It can be used as reward or punishment. I also really like to tap into all of the senses when I write. The easiest one for most people is visual, describing things that you see, maybe sounds, but smell and taste and touch, those are senses that they're harder to describe and represent, and yet they're among the most primitive of our senses, like the olfactory and the sense of taste. So I guess I'm trying to get really visceral there. It's also just a lot of fun to do research on food, and find out what traditional dishes are. Often my characters, maybe their backgrounds are in other countries. Originally, several of my books about immigrants from different parts of the world. And it's just, I guess if I can make readers salivate, that, that's pretty good too. Yeah.
When you say using the sensory detail in a visceral way, actually, another thing that came to mind from this book is the different approaches to cleanliness that the various kids have. And some of those details I found quite visceral for the less cleanly households, which contributes to deliberately in some ways. But and also with being somewhat disabled and needing to navigate the world with a walker, the spatial arrangements of the various homes and how easy and difficult they are to move through, that also felt like the furniture of the world in a literal kind of way. I really felt that, like knocking into things, and really appreciated those kinds of details to sort of think about what it would be like to be embodied in M's body, I guess you might say. So we've kind of touched on the fact that you write short fiction, and that this novel began with a short story. And then others have too. So a brain, a heart, the nerve, that began with a fiction, with a short story, the fictionalized biography of an actor who played one of the Munchkins in The Wizard of Oz. And then
Right, he played the coroner. Yeah.
And then a woman who survives the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. You wrote a story about her and about surviving that, and then you turned that into a novel that is based on that it tells the story of her and her daughter, with whom she is pregnant at the time that she survives that fire, right? And does On the Shore, did that begin with a short story or no?
No, it started, but as part of a story, but I think for that one, I knew from the beginning that it would have to be a novel and told from multiple perspectives. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, because also you write quite a lot of short fiction, and you actually kind of write a lot of novels. We'll get to that too. But how do you decide, or what tells you that a story that you've written needs to be expanded into a novel? How do you choose?
Yeah. Some stories, they just feel complete in themselves, in the time frame, and for the character, it says enough of what I want to say. Others, I find that the characters, they just continue to live with me. I mean, I continue to converse with them. My characters are always become real people while I'm working on it, whether it's a story or a novel. But some of them just linger on. And I become more curious about investigating their past, but especially wondering what happens to them after the end of the story. I suppose we all do that as readers. The best books or stories are the ones where you read the last sentence and you find yourself wondering, okay, what happens next? And in fact, that's actually how I ended up writing my first novel. At that point, I had been just writing and publishing short stories for a long time. And I published one. It was called The Munchkins at Grossinger's. I just imagine the Munchkins having a 25th reunion at Grossinger's Hotel in the Catskills. Don't ask me where that idea came from. It just arose. Anyway, an agent had seen another short story of mine, and contacted me and said, I like your writing. Do you have a novel I can look at? And I said, well, no, I don't. How long can you wait for me to write one? He said, as long as it takes. So I started thinking, what on earth could I write a novel about? I'd never done one before. And I realized that it was the protagonist from this story about the Munchkins. I just got really interested in his history. And so I ended up writing a fictional biography of the actor who played the Munchkin coroner in that movie, beginning with his time in pre-World War II Berlin, where he fled from the hygiene policies of the Nazis. And then basically, looking at him from 1935 until around 1965, so tracing his history, but totally fictionalized. The only thing that was real about him was his name and the fact that he played the coroner, maybe his height, but the biography totally. And that became my first novel. which the agent rejected. It eventually found another publisher, but it got me started writing novels. And since then I've written both.
Yeah. And so they're all historical, but you do a lot around the world wars. So on the shore, with one of your characters running off to fight in the war, sneaking off, we should say, running away to fight in the war. And then the one that you have, can we talk about the one you just got accepted that will be coming out in September?
Yeah.
Yeah. And this one is a World War II setting.
Mhm.
Could you tell us a little bit about it?
So I just signed the contract for my next book yesterday. And this, so on the shore, it's a World War I era. And that's actually about an immigrant family on the Lower East Side, where a teenage son lies about his name and age to go off and fight in the war without telling his family, and he's not heard from again. So it looks at sort of what happens to him, his rebellious younger sister, and an uncle who tries to go and find the boy. And then for the one that will be coming out in September, it's called One Person's Loss. That's about a German Jewish refugee couple. And it begins shortly before World War II. And their families send the young couple to America in anticipation of an oncoming slaughter, with the idea that they want this young couple to have children in America, basically, and keep the family and people of their religion alive. And so it sort of looks at what happens to them. It's interesting too, speaking of like sort of quirky events in history that spark ideas, that one also started as a short story. I think it may have been like an interview on StoryCorps. I know how many of you hear that on public radio locally every Friday morning. But it was an interview. It was between a woman who was what was known as an incubator baby and a relative. So it turns out that from 1903 to 1943, at Coney Island Amusement Park, there was actually an exhibit of babies in incubators. This is before incubators were widely used in hospitals. And it was
for 40 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like just for decades. And actually before that, I think there was an exhibit at like the Chicago World's Fair, and people paid a quarter to go in and see these little premature babies in incubators. And so I try to imagine, who would actually go in and look at this, and people were fascinated by it. And anyhow, it's sort of, I came up with this couple, and the wife had just had a miscarriage, and she, when she's recovered enough, the first day out, they happen to go to Coney Island, and she's attracted to this exhibit, and she becomes obsessed with adopting a baby who happens to be a Jewish baby, adopting a baby in the exhibit over her husband's objections. So that became just a short story, about them. And then again, that's a couple I found myself really wondering, well, what happens next? And the story was just from the wife's perspective. The novel alternates perspective between the husband and the wife, and sort of follows them some before, during, and for about 6 or 7 years after the war. And it's really an examination of a strained marriage.
And the husband actually ends up going off to the war, as I recall.
Yeah, he ends up essentially serving as a spy because, I mean, they're from Berlin. He speaks German, and he doesn't look overly Jewish. So yeah, he's the forerunner of the CIA, the OSS. They were trying to recruit people who were fluent in German, who could essentially go over there and embed in German society and serve as spies. And so he ends up doing that for several years. Yeah, that was really interesting to research too.
And Tazia and Gemma, so that one isn't so focused on the war, but there's the immigrant theme, which is similar to On the Shore and this forthcoming novel. But Tazia is from Italy. She's
right. She's a young Italian immigrant. Probably a lot of people have heard of the Triangle Waste Company fire. I mean, that was in 1911. It was one of the worst labor disasters in the country. But of the 146 employees who were killed, the vast majority were immigrant girls and women. And so I try to imagine, so much has been written about the fire, but I never read anything that took the perspective in depth of one of the survivors. And so I imagine this, young 17-year-old Italian immigrant, not married, pregnant from an affair with a married man, a devout Catholic in spite of all of that. And for her, the fire actually gives her an opportunity to escape an awful situation, because she's terrified of the shame that it will bring on her family back in Italy. So the fire lets her flee and leave her family and everybody to think she's dead. And so it follows her for like 50 years as she sort of gradually moves farther and farther west, taking all these low-skilled jobs. It was a real chance to look at some of the horrors of the unskilled labor, like the Chicago meatpacking industry and others. And it's told from 2 points of view, also the mother's perspective over those 50 years. And then the daughter, who's now 50 years old, knows nothing about her father. The mother has refused to tell her. So the daughter becomes really curious to find out who her father is. Her son's about to get married and she wants to give it to her son as a wedding present. This is who your grandfather is. So the daughter's story moves backwards in time. And she interviews all these people who knew her mother, going farther and farther back to try and figure out who her father might be.
Yeah.
So that's how I expanded that story into a 50-year novel.
You like that 50-year increment, like this one, this current one also. The
A lot happens in 50 years, so
yeah. A lot does, yeah.
So it looks like we have a question from the audience. Oscar wants to know what inspired you to make this book?
Okay. Oscar's my 9-year-old grandson, assuming that's the Oscar who asked it. I think it's when I found out about this weird event called the Great Stork Derby. I mean, imagine a contest where you get a prize for having as many babies as you can in 10 years. And that just seemed like really weird to me. And I didn't think I would like growing up in a family that was that big. So, the best part about writing fiction is you get to use your imagination. And so I was inspired to write this because I could really use my imagination and think what it would be like to have all these brothers and sisters and parents who didn't get along. And how would you come out of that? And could there ever be a happy ending to a story that started with such a sad beginning? And so that's what made me curious to write the book.
Laura wants to know, so how many babies did M and his wife end up having? How many did the contest winner have?
I think I'm going to encourage people to read the book to find out the answer. All I would say is that they had a lot, and the contest winners had a lot. In the end, the prize was split between 4 winners. And so, I mean, a lot of those sorts of details are accurate in the book. I mean, when I write historical fiction, the emphasis is more on fiction than history, but there are certain facts that I really do want to get right, you know, like the chronology and major things. I can't stand anachronisms. So, you know, I always make sure that stuff is correct. So a lot of the details about the Derby itself are accurate, and it was split among four people.
Laura,
and it was worth a lot of money by then. Yeah.
Laura wants to know that she did order the book tonight. We have another
Literati. Support your local independent bookstore, everybody.
Mm-hmm. And then we have another question. I was wondering how Anne, you create the structure and architecture of a novel. What is your process?
You know, it just comes to me. I can't say that I'm very systematic or methodological. In the same way that for me, often I know that there's a story in something that I hear or read, but I can't write the story until I know whose story it is, which means, you know, like figuring out from whose point of view it should be told. And it just comes to me. This story needs to be told from this person's point of view and in this voice. And hi, Kat. And and you know, a lot of them are told from multiple perspectives. Occasionally, it's told from just one. And again, it just that's the sort of stuff that just comes to me. You know, so I can't say I really go through a process that I leave to the muses. I mean, I know why the Greeks invented them, because sometimes you just don't know where an idea comes from, or you read something that you've written and you say, gee, did I really write that? So that's, you know, thank the muses for that.
All right. We have a question from Rachel. When did you start writing? Was it only after you retired from early childhood education?
I had always, one of the things that I wrote a lot of books when I was you know, in the early childhood field, a lot for teachers and parents. And for me, the favorite part, and a lot of them were, you know, like research professional books, but I really liked writing for that audience, because I like to illustrate it with sort of little stories or vignettes. That was sort of my favorite part of those. And so I thought, gee, it would be fun to try my hand at writing fiction one of these days when I retire. And then about 15 years before I retired, I thought, well, why wait? Why don't I see if I like it now, so that when I do retire, I can just sort of move into a different kind of work. So I started writing fiction. I just took a class at the community college, and I discovered that I loved it. So I just kind of kept doing that on the side. And then when I retired, I just moved into doing it full time. But it made transition out of retirement very easy, because I like to work, and you know, I just sitting at a different desk and working all day there. So it was an easy transition.
All right, we're gonna wrap up on this next question that actually several people have asked. The audience would like to know, how do you choose the names of your characters?
That is the most fun. So part of it is also a bit of historical research. I mean, I like to see what names were really common or popular in a certain era, or if they're from other cultures or backgrounds. But at least for the main characters, I like them to be a bit quirky. So I might take a name that was popular at that time, but substitute a few letters so that it's unique, because I think unusual names stick in people's minds. I think for the minor characters, they might be more ordinary, but also I think like Charles Dickens was a master at coming up with names that personified character. So, you know, I also like to do that. And in fact, in the Great Stork Derby, M wants every child to have an unusual name. Another bone of contention between him and his wife. So it was just fun making up a lot of weird names for that one, a house full of weird names.
Great. Thank you so much to Anne and Danielle for joining us on Literati at Home. A reminder to the audience to purchase the Great Stork Derby. The link is in the chat. And good night, everyone. It looks like we reached the top of the hour.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. Enjoy. Bye-bye.